We're very pleased to see you here. Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, and this time I really feel among friends because I see so many colleagues and so many people we've been working with in the past years. So it really feels very nice to see you all here tonight. And I know it's a very busy time again because the season sort of starts with the day after Labor Day. So it's particularly nice that you carved out some time to be here today to discuss with us on effective financial regulation 10 years after the financial crisis, with the distinguished speakers from the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. My name is Luise Rürup. I work for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung since more than 25 years, and I head the office in New York right now. And I would like to tell you more about the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, but I did this partly this morning, and I would not like to take up much time right now. We've been involved with work on taxation and collective action, the reform of the international tax system, and we've been involved with the ICRICT, with the Commission right from the beginning, and we feel very privileged to be associated with this very, very important line of work. So 10 years after the financial crisis, which shocked and rocked the world in 2008, where do we stand? Do we have a safer and sounder financial system which supports the economy? Have we progressed in making our economies more resilient, more socially just and environmentally sound, with a financial system which supports a sustainable and equitable economic development? Can we safely say that in the next crisis or crash, it will not be those least involved who pay the highest price? It does not seem so. The reform of the financial system remains incomplete and in many ways flawed, even regressing. Finance has gained influence, inequality is persisting and in many places worsening. Economies seem to be vulnerable and unsustainable as ever. New ideas are needed to redress the world financial system's flaws, distortions, and imbalances. And a new momentum is needed to push for reforms and better regulation of the global financial system. 3 years ago, when for the first time in human history a globally shared agenda on social progress and economic transformation was launched, there seemed to be some momentum in the right direction. In September 2015, UN member states adopted the 2030 Agenda and signaled with the title Transforming Our World clearly the need for fundamental changes in politics, economies, and society. 3 years after its adoption in 2018, there are, however, no clear signals that governments have turned the vision of the 2030 Agenda into comprehensive and congruent policies aiming at leaving no one behind. Tax competition between countries has led to a harmful race to the bottom and has allowed 10% of global gross domestic product to be held in tax havens. Currently, corporate profits are rising while tax revenues are falling. To be able to meet the challenges of the 21st century, nations need to increase the ability for domestic resource mobilization. This means effectively stopping illicit financial flows and setting up a transparent system of taxation in a global economy. The global economy requires stability so that the needs of the 99% can be met. A resilient financial system is fundamental to any progress in eradicating poverty in all its dimensions and the realization of human rights to ensure life and dignity for all. The commissioners of the Independent Commission on the International Corporate Taxation have, since its inception in 2015, submitted groundbreaking proposals on how to improve the taxation system with a holistic, truly global approach. In today's forum, we will have the opportunity to hear from the commissioners or from the Commission in its analytical assessments and policy proposals. Tapping also into all the knowledge and experience and expertise in the audience, we hope that the evening will promote an exchange of experiences and concrete practices, bringing together the elements necessary for building a global consensus for reforms in financial regulation. I would like to thank the commissioners of ICRICT and our respondent, Stephen Lerner from the Kalmanowitz Institute for Labor and the Working Poor at the Georgetown University, for engaging in tonight's debate. And I would like to thank ICRICT, particularly Tommaso and Lamia in the Secretariat, for great collaboration in bringing this event about. Special thanks go to Rana Farua, who is the global business columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times, and author of many groundbreaking publications in this, on many topics related to the economy, the global economy, and finance. And today, she is our moderator for the debate on effective regulation in the world of finance. So with heartfelt thanks, I hand over to you, Rana.
Okay, thank you so much, Louise. Can everybody hear me? Great. Thanks so much for that introduction. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be amongst friends and sources, and I feel that, you know, traveling in the world of people that care about these issues, I keep seeing the same faces at all the same conferences, so I think we're going to have a very fun and robust discussion here amongst friends. So, so with that, let me just introduce our panelists. We're going to speak together for maybe a half an hour or so, and I think because it's such a small room and many of you are very knowledgeable about these topics, we're then going to open it up and everybody can have a chance to participate. So let me start by just quickly introducing people who need no introductions here. To my direct right, we have Jose Antonio Ocampo, who is a professor at Columbia University's SIPA School of International Public Affairs. To his right, we have Jayati Ghosh, who is a professor of economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. To her right, we have the one and only Joe Stiglitz, who is the Nobel laureate in economics, university professor at Columbia, and my personal rabbi, even though I'm not Jewish. And to his right, we have Wayne Swan, the national president of the Labour Party in Australia. It's going to be wonderful to have someone that's really been in the trenches as a minister to talk about this. And finally, on the very end, we have Gabrielle Zuckman, who's an assistant professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and has done some great work on the topic. So let me start, Joe. I'm actually going to start with you, because when we were sort of going back and forth about all the topics to cover, you said we need to make sure to really draw out the links between the financial crisis and the anniversary of the financial crisis and what this commission is doing around tax. And it seems to me, and I'd be curious your view, that the core issue here is about trust. It's about trust and legitimacy. And, you know, the 2008 crisis was a crisis of trust. Clearly the way it was handled has led to an even bigger crisis of trust. Tax and tax offshoring before and after the crisis has been an issue of trust that has resulted in a degradation of institutional trust. Trust in liberal democracy is down in many of the countries that we're all from and represent. Do you see that same parallel, and what other parallels might you draw?
Yeah, well, you said it better than I could, so let me just say. So I think that is one of the fundamental connections. There are a couple of others that one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the crisis was that many countries, advanced countries, all of a sudden became aware that they had huge deficits. And the one salutary aspect of that was that they started saying is, why don't we have more revenue? And there was an obvious answer: the tax avoidance, tax evasion that was rampant, and that began a process of looking at the secrecy havens, the Panamas. To me, it was a little bit, it was remarkable that these secrecy havens were not fundamental to causing the crisis, but the shortage of revenue really focused attention on them. And, sort of, I think they didn't want to talk about the real problems of excessive risk-taking and the bad behavior of the banks. So it was a lot easier to focus on Panama. But that was a good thing, to focus on that. And as that started happening, I have to give credit to investigative journalists who really uncovered the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, that brought out the magnitude of the tax avoidance that was going on. Gabriel was doing some really good work looking at the numbers from a macro point of view, but the stories that exposed the politicians in every country that were involved brought it home and made it, I think, a very big global issue. I think, though, that as it became global, just one more remark, one other aspect of the 2008 crisis was that it was a global financial crisis. And it had to do with the way something that began in the United States spread all over the world, made it clear that globalization was playing a very big role.
Yeah.
But the international community was not really willing to look at, as much as they should have,
Yeah.
the way the global financial system worked. And that even goes to the particularly narrow question that we are talking about here, tax evasion, tax avoidance. There was a process in the UN, Finance for Development, where these issues are particularly important for developing countries because money really is a shortage and has real consequences for poverty, for development. And the big issue in the Addis Ababa meeting was who was going to be in charge of the process of rethinking the global tax structure. Were you going to put the fox in charge of the hens? And that was the U.S. position. India made a valiant attempt to say, no, it should be in the UN, it should be where everybody has a voice, rather than the OECD, where the advanced countries were dominant. But sadly, the U.S. won,
Yeah.
and the world lost.
Yeah. All right, we're going to dig in more deeply to the particulars of what has and hasn't been done in terms of reform in the last 10 years. But Wayne, I want to maybe go to you now because you were really in the trenches as a finance minister when the crisis happened. You've been in politics since. You've seen the trajectory. Speak a little bit to the practical political paradigm that Joe is sketching here, and what did you see going down that led us to where we are now? And were there turning points? Were there things that could have been done differently that you would really point to politically?
Oh, you've got half an hour?
Yeah. You can have 5 minutes.
Well, 10 years ago, I mean, we were really in the trenches. We were staring down the barrel of the Great Depression Mark II. And I have a vivid memory of sitting at a G20 finance ministers meeting in early October following the IMF meeting that day, and President George Bush, coming to the emergency meeting and very directly saying to the finance ministers from both the developed and the developing world that the United States accepted its responsibility for the contagion that it had inflicted on the global economy, which at that stage the prospect was that the developed economies were falling off a cliff. Developing economies were a bit unsure about what was going to happen, but we knew that we were in the middle of a crisis. So 10 years ago, in October, we were talking about about economic volatility that we hadn't seen in 80 years. And I'm struck now, 10 years on, that we're dealing with political volatility that we haven't seen in 80 years. We should never forget that 1929 was followed by 1939. And the point that I make is that big economic shakeouts, big economic events have very big political consequences. And the truth is that we are living with those big political consequences right now. So I am fearful that if we were to have another economic event 10 years on, that there's no way in the world that global leadership, the likes of that delivered by Bush, and it's remarkable, isn't it, to think about a Republican actually having a view that they might have some global responsibility for what's going on. But
amazing.
But that response was delivered by a range of middle-sized, developed and developing countries that came together to summon the political courage to take the steps to avoid a Great Depression Mark II, and not perfectly, but over a period of 3 or 4 years, putting in place both stimulus as well as reforms to the financial system to at least stabilise where we were. And it's true that we've had a really weak and anaemic recovery over a 10-year period, and there's been a lot of pain and hurt inflicted on a lot of people in the early stages of all of that. But now, as we face really what I see as a crisis when it comes to achieving, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, where we need real leadership about inequality, that we couldn't summon the same degree of international cooperation to deal with the sabotage which is caused by the tax termites in the corporate sector, who are massively evading their responsibilities to pay tax. And it is true that doing something about corporate tax avoidance isn't the be-all and end-all of reconstructing tax systems which will deliver revenue to make the Sustainable Development Goals possible. But it's certainly a very big part of the equation, because if large players in the system can't be trusted, and we go back to this word trust, can't be trusted to actually stump up to meet their responsibilities, then it's going to be very, very hard for everybody else in the system to go out and sell new revenue measures that are required to lift the tax to GDP ratios across the developing world so that people can get the health and education services that they need. So I'm fearful in some ways, 10 years on, that we have less trust, that we have less policy firepower, and less understanding of the two key lessons, and I'll stop here, that I learnt from the crisis. The first one is the importance of fiscal policy, both tax and expenditure, and they have to come together to be discussed. And the second one is that dealing with inequality is the preeminent issue of our time, and dealing with inequality isn't just a question for good social policy, absolutely central to good economic policy.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Jayati, I'm going to turn to you now, because we really need to understand the impact, particularly at this moment, on developing countries. Because, you know, we're looking back, but we're also looking ahead. I mean, we're in an incredibly volatile moment right now. There have been so many implications of 2008 in the developing world. I mean, one is an issue of, should we go the direction that the U.S. and Europe have gone? What should our governmental systems look like? But also the issue of debt. More debt out there than before the crisis. I've forgotten the exact metric, but certainly quite a bit more. We're now seeing the ripple effects of that playing out. Where are we going to go from here? And give us a scorecard of how, you know, not just in India, but other countries, how these issues have been dealt with. Are there best practices, you know, mistakes that we should learn from?
Yeah, well, you know, in fact, I think for most people in the developing world, most analysts, what's really startling is what changed was that emerging markets decided to adopt the very policies that had caused the crisis.
Yeah.
So, you know, you would think that would be the opposite.
I think Joe wrote a book about that. I guess
exactly.
I didn't get
Yeah, but, you know, after the book is when everybody did it. So it was almost like, which is bizarre but true. So we are now, I would say most developing countries are now more vulnerable than they were in 2008. Because they're more deeply integrated and more fundamentally reliant on debt for expansion. So first of all, and I think in a way, the point that has already been made, the underlying problem is the inability to tax. So wherever you go, there is this sort of basic belief among governments that you can't raise revenues. Or if you can, it's only through goods and services taxes and regressive measures. So if you can't raise revenues, obviously you can't spend beyond a point. So if you need expansion, you're going to go to monetary policy. Or you will go to governments raising debt in order to spend more. And this is the story everywhere. So we now have, in all the successful economies, I'm leaving China out because China is totally sui generis. We can talk about it later. But all the other developing countries, the expansion has been based entirely on debt. And that has come home to roost already in some countries, which are experiencing significant crisis. The bubble is about to burst in a number of others. So you have a combination of allowing excessive debt in both public and private sectors, and allowing the same kinds of financial deregulation, securitization, derivative markets, all of the stuff that caused the crisis in the developed world to play out now.
Yeah.
It takes very little. It can take a small political change. It can take, the sort of domino effect of other countries. But I think we're going to see it unfold, I would say, even within the next year.
Wow. Jose Antonio, I'm going to ask you to, a very negative moment to jump in, but I'm going to ask you to kind of build on that. And A, do you agree with that analysis? What else would you say in regards to how fiscal policy was managed post-2008 in both the developed and the developing world?
Well, let me say I have, just for information, I'm now in the Central Bank of Colombia. So,
okay.
so I'm
Not on your bio.
actually we are
So that's good. You're in the trenches
Colombia
as well.
with O. I said Colombia with O, not Colombia with you. Anyway, so we, in a sense, we are in the now in the trenches because of the exactly of the impact. I mean, the questioning what is the impact of this current turmoil, which in part is related to the reversal of U.S. Monetary policy, which has, but it's more associated with at least a few cases, but I don't think it's so generalized as Yati says of countries that incur in a debt-led growth, which is true of some countries. But I mean, a big question is whether the in the past, let's say, like the American debt crisis of the 1980s or the effects of the Asian crisis of 97 and the Russia in 98, those were widespread crises in large parts of the emerging world. Which were actually long crises. They lasted. That the American debt crisis for Latin America lasted for 8 years. The Asian crisis lasted for 6 years, let's say, more or less. Actually, interestingly, the 2008 crisis, which some of us call the North Atlantic. I mean, very, very funny that when the crisis takes place in developing countries, they're called with names. The East Asia and the Latin America. But
Oh my God, that's a great observation. I'm going to steal that for the column. That's a great
when
observation.
it happens in the U.S., it's a global.
Great, very good.
Anyway, very interestingly, the North Atlantic crisis, which is how we call it, because it was North Atlantic.
Yeah.
Australia, for example, was not as affected either. so it's anyway. Interestingly, it lasted only for about 1 year in terms of their effects. I mean, of course, there are positive parts and negative parts. I mean, I would say the positive parts is the fact that at least for a couple of years there was expansionary policies in the developed countries. But even more, there was the largest what I call the largest Keynesian package in history, which is what the Chinese did in 2008. The most expansionary package you have ever seen. And then the developing world and emerging markets recover in a sense to some extent led by China actually, but also by the fact that, I mean, in a true sense, China, because China not only became a big market for almost all developing countries, but also led to the recovery of commodity prices. So the falling commodity prices in 2008 was very short, thanks to China, in a sense. Anyway, but also very importantly, and in contrast to the current situation, there was a fairly good agreement by in the G20 not to affect international trade, not to do protectionist policies as a response, and then reminding the negative effect that they had during the Great Depression of the 1930s. But the negative part is what Yayati said, that the expansionary monetary policies of developed countries led capital to flow into emerging and developing countries, and many of them got over-indebted. And then we're seeing some of the effects now that the U.S., of course, is reversing its policy and its monetary policy. Now, A big question mark, however, is whether we are in an environment of equal in terms of the effects on all emerging markets, or whether the situation is concentrated in a few countries. I mean,
What's your take? What's your personal take?
My take is the second, that so far what we see is a huge impact on Turkey and Argentina. There are some intermediate cases like Brazil, South Africa, Russia, and then the rest, which have been affected, but very, not so strong so far. I mean, I'm not saying that there is not going to be large contagion, but we have not seen large contagion for a decade actually. I mean, after 2008, 2009, in which there was of course widespread contagion. You can see, for example, the euro crisis of 2011, 2012. It had almost no effect in emerging markets. Then even the Chinese, the outflow of capital from China of 2015 and early 2016.
You want to speak into the mic?
Yeah, the huge crisis, the huge outflow of capital from China had almost no effect elsewhere in the emerging world. So when you see this year, for example, March, April was very tough in Turkey and Argentina, but elsewhere, there were not major effects. Now the August events, let's say, have been more widespread, but again with the huge differences across countries. So I actually wrote an op-ed in Project Syndicate saying maybe the nature of the emerging crisis, the crisis in the emerging markets have changed. That now there is not going to be widespread contagion as it was true in the past. We have to see whether this is correct. That's my difference of opinion with Yayate.
Okay. So Gabriel, I'm going to come down to you now and ask you to go a little more practical for a moment before we delve into some of these issues a little more deeply. You focused a lot on the data, the numbers in tax evasion and the relation to wealth inequality and growth. What lessons, if any, have been learned from the Panama Papers? Where are you actually seeing any real change on the ground? And to the extent that we are now, personally, I think tapped out on monetary policy in some ways, in desperate need of fiscal stimulus to get us through potentially the next bubble, where are we going to be? What are the incentives for changing things on the tax side?
Yes, I guess there are two main lessons from leaks like the Panama Papers. Before that, there was the Swiss leaks from HSBC, Switzerland. After that, there was the Paradise Papers. One is that there are deep cultural problems in some parts of the financial industry, in the offshore financial industry in particular, but not only. There is just a big part of finance that helps people launder money or evade taxes. And that was also a broader lesson from the financial crisis. There is criminality in the financial industry. There is a problem of incentives. You can get very rich by helping people evade taxes, launder money, or by taking excessive risk and so on. And the sanctions for the bankers and the financial institutions and the law firms that facilitate these financial crimes are just too small. And I think the financial crisis has been a lost opportunity to actually tackle that problem. I don't see any real progress on that dimension, on curbing criminality in the financial and legal offshore sector. So for instance, now we have an automatic exchange of bank information, which is a big progress compared to what was the case before the financial crisis. But the assumption is we can trust, the bankers in Panama or law firms in Panama or bankers in Switzerland to truthfully report to the IRS or to the French tax authority about what their clients are doing. And these are very same people who for decades have been hiding their clients behind shell companies and, you know, handing out bank statements concealed in, you know, sports magazines and smuggling diamonds in toothpaste tubes. And so now we're asking them, okay, please, you know, help us enforce taxes. That's incredibly, in my view, incredibly naive and not satisfactory. So that's the I think one of the main lesson. Another lesson and a broader lesson is that I think we've failed over the last 10 years at, you know, making globalization more sustainable, politically and economically speaking. So, you know, globalization is redistributing income. You know, some people see their income and their wealth grow a lot. And you would expect the tax system to redistribute that. So that's what economists have been saying for decades. They've been saying, you know, globalization is great and it's going to create a lot of wealth, and, you know, governments will step in to redistribute the gains from globalization such that everybody benefits from that process. Now, what has happened is that the very winners from globalization have seen their taxes fall. You know, most spectacularly multinational corporations. So the US just cut its rate from 35 to 21%. France is cutting its corporate income tax. And it's a global that has accelerated a lot, actually, since the financial crisis. So the very winners see their taxes fall, and the lost revenue have to be made up for by higher taxes for the rest of us, the very people who actually don't benefit from globalization, so retirees or small businesses, or employees or government workers. And I highly doubt that this can continue for a long time. It's pretty clear.
So I recently heard a high-level politician say that he felt the most powerful entities in the world right now were the US, China, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple, which I thought was very interesting. You're talking about this shift that's been happening pre-2008, post-2008. It's now kind of, in a way, being put on steroids by the shift in the economy from tangibles to intangibles. All the companies that were most able to offshore profits beforehand are becoming a more important part of the economy. I mean, that would seem to really amp up this problem. Where's the leverage? No pun intended, but where's the political leverage here, particularly at a time of growing political extremism? I don't know if anybody, Wayne, do you want to jump in on that? Because you all have had some interesting examples too in curbing multinational corporations. Maybe you can share some thoughts.
Well, it's certainly waiting for a significant politician to call out this behaviour, and I think the environment is right for a mainstream politician to simply make the point that if we continue to ignore the distributional implications of tax evasion and the rest of our policies, that in fact what it is going to produce is more and more political extremism. I think it's really that simple, and I think there was a bit of a lost opportunity under President Obama, who was dealing with difficult circumstances, but I don't think that this sort of behaviour was called out enough, and there's no doubt that you know, the burning unfairness of what occurred during the global financial crisis in the United States, which left millions and millions of working class people behind and or destitute or having lost their homes, when at the same time the perpetrators of that, none went to jail, and there seemed to be no implications for the top end of town, that it is calling out for a Roosevelt type politician to call out this bad corporate behaviour, and as Roosevelt said, welcome their hatred.
Jayadi, you wanted to jump in.
Well, yeah, and I'm delighted that Wayne mentioned Roosevelt, because, you know, I think that's part of what you're talking about, and the taxation issue is part of the fact that basically we have much, much more monopoly power now than we had even just before the crisis. So it's remarkable that concentration in industry, whether it is finance, manufacturing, or the digital industries, has increased dramatically, but also their corporate lobbying power has gone up. And we're not doing enough to contain that. So I think the critical thing, if you think about Roosevelt and the New Deal, is that it was not only recovery. Of course, it was recovery and the very large fiscal stimulus that was rapid and generous and all of that. But it was also about regulation and redistribution. It was about strong regulation of the labor markets and of companies.
Yeah.
And redistribution, not just in terms of taxes, but also enabling workers to associate and fight for better
Yeah.
conditions.
You know, Joe.
But
Joe-
excuse me, you don't have
go
to go
ahead.
back that far. I mean, you
Yeah.
can go to Johnson's Great Society speech.
Joe, I want to jump in and ask you to weigh in because I hear some of the new kind of progressive millennials that are coming up, Alex Ocasio-Cortez, she's talking about a Green New Deal, which I believe that you also wrote a book about. Are we potentially at a turning point? And how, and if so, let's be optimistic for a moment and just have a thought experiment. If so, how do you make that a global paradigm shift at a time when politics are more and more national?
Well, first, I do think that you might say this millennial shift is one source of optimism. You know, the recognition that their future is at stake and the direction that the United States is going, but this is also true in other parts of the world, is one that's pretty bleak and not one that a lot they want to be part of. So there is this moment, you might say, of democracy where we might go back from, we've gone to, in the United States particularly, where money is so important in politics, with a system of $1, one vote. We might go back to more, to closer to one person, one vote. And that, but that there are strong forces against this. And one of them is highlighted by the point that you made, that globally there's clear evidence that the strength of monopoly power has increased. It's not only the monopoly power, the power of corporations, it's also the bargaining power of workers has decreased. And that's been not only a result of weakening of unions, it's the way we structure globalization, investment agreements that give foreign investor, if you invest abroad, you get more stronger property rights than if you invest at home. So that really weakens the bargaining power of workers. There's been a whole sort of thing. So on both sides, wages are driven down and profits are driven up. Any way you calculate it, the share of national income, corporate income that is going towards monopoly profits, rents, has increased significantly. The challenge is that I think they understand this, and they understand that they make these profits only because of the rules of the market economy as we've constructed them over the last 30, 40 years, give them the opportunity to do this. So we've moved into the political battlefield of rewriting these rules. They know that their future, that the corporations know their future is at stake. The question is, do the rest know that? And they're willing, if you're making these hundreds of billions of dollars, it pays to invest a little bit in political life. And the only counterbalance is, you might say, people power. It's not the money that in the end counts. And there are a number of instances where this really has worked.
It's, Jose, I know you want to jump in here. I want to just make one observation. When you were saying political power, I thought you were talking about lobbying, which of course has gone up in lockstep with some of the changes you're talking about. So go ahead and jump in.
No, I wanted to mention at the international level, what is the big issue? I mean, and by far the big issue is how multilateralism is being destroyed. The U.S. it was the, let's say, the mother of multilateralism after the Second World War. Then, of course, in recent decades, it has, frequently not been, as much as multilateralist as, and has not joined some agreements at different times or have left some organizations. But what is going on now, I think is unprecedented since the Second World War. The fact that the U.S. is consistently attacking all multilateral orders. And of course, in economic terms, but before that, just another, put it the reflection of the European Union. I mean, in contrast to the U.S. and during my 10 years in the United Nations, I saw this frequently. They say the European Union was the main multilateral force, or the main force in favor of multilateralism. I was multilateral by nature, let's say. Now, so the crisis of the European Union is also, highly problematic now, because there is not that force either, which on many occasions I saw counteracting the weak, the weaker or weaker areas of commitment of the United States in relation to multilateralism. And of course, in the economic area, you can say there has been a bit of advance in the last 10 years. Actually, in tax cooperation, there is a bit more than there used to be. Associated with the the OECD basically being in charge of it. But for example, in finance, there was a lot of cooperation, but again, the U.S. is trying to slip away from those commitments now. But the worst that is going on is trade. And in the trade area is, we are really, I mean, the U.S. seems to be in favor of the system that was developed by Germany in the 1930s, which was a system of fragmenting the international trading order, which was terrible for the world economy. And I think that's a real, I mean, and the announcement that it may be even leave the WTO is one of the worst announcements if it materializes.
So I totally agree with that, by the way, and I think that that's not just a Trump-specific thing. I think that there's forces on the far right and far left, actually, that are anti-trade. Anyway, we have maybe 20 more minutes left, so I want to ask one more question, then open it up to you all. Let's talk a little bit about China. Jayati, you kind of flicked at that earlier. There's sort of two narratives right now out there about China. One of them is that the more optimistic is that, okay, Xi's consolidation of power is really about controlling the elites. The Chinese are spending money in the right places. They're building a new kind of multilateralism in Asia. The other narrative, of course, is that this is a giant debt bubble waiting to explode that makes, Florida and Arizona look very minor by comparison. So I think I'd like to just go down the line, given that a lot of people feel China is really at the epicenter of what may happen in the next 10 years. Tell me a little bit about how positive or negatively you're feeling about China and how they've handled things and will handle things. So why don't we?
No, I think
Okay, Joe, why don't you start and then me?
Okay, so.
Okay, we'll go.
Okay.
Whoever wants to grab the mic, go.
Okay, so first, I think China, we were talking before about the response to the crisis was debt-driven growth. And I've been talking there a lot. They haven't changed that model. And, we were talking about politics in the West being against taxes. The remarkable thing is it's also true in China. I've been trying to say, you need a pollution tax, a carbon tax, you need a property tax, all these things that would increase equality, because inequality is also a big issue in China. And that is an alternative to your model of debt-driven growth. And while, interestingly, the finance minister will say yes every year, And then the next year when I see him, he'll say, well, you know, we've had some political difficulties in getting this. And so for me, it's interesting because it's very different from the model that we sometimes have. The other issue, though, is that I want to raise is in terms of multilateralism in China, it has now put itself forward as the main defender, of the rules-based international order. I think that's true, but one has to put an important caveat. The kind of global international order that a lot of us were interested in was one that pushed human rights, democracy, and that's not high on China's agenda. And some of at the same time, I think exposed some of the difficulties of the old trade model, where we ignored differences in values and we just said, let free trade rip. In some of the new areas that you were talking about, technology, there's a lot of concern. AI, the big advantage, the key input to AI, success in AI, is data. And different views about privacy in China, the United States, and Europe really raise questions about what does it mean to have free trade. And I think that it will force us to re-examine more closely our trade regime. We don't want to go back to the isolation.
Right.
But I think we will need to re-examine what do we mean by a level playing field, and what do we mean by a kind of trade regime that not only promotes economic growth, but other values that we care about.
So rewriting the rules. Anybody else want to jump in on
Yeah,
Jody and then Wayne.
yes, I think China's incredibly complex. I don't think its debt bubble is going to burst in the same way because it's a very different financial system. I mean, I agree that it's heavily debt-based, both public and private, but nonetheless, it still has very significant control over finance. The state banks still control about 65% of transactions. They have reined in shadow banking quite significantly over the last 3 years. So I don't see a kind of collapse of the same, you won't get a subprime kind of thing at all in China. It's not,
But they also have more tools.
Exactly. They have many more tools. So that's not going to happen. Internally, I think they also have a very, very long-term strategic vision. I mean, it's very clear. They have done so much investment in innovation over the last 10 years. They have really, and they had the great advantage, they did never let Google in and so on. So they could build their own, right? They have their own Alibaba and their own Tencent, and who are all global giants. So they have now got the power of scale. So I don't see economic problems necessarily in the medium term for Chinese. However, China and the rest of the developing world, it's much more complicated. And this whole notion that either China can become an alternative growth pole or become the savior of the developing world, I think both are misplaced. Also because when you look at China's interactions, they're very similar to North-South interactions. I mean, okay, they don't care about the human rights of that country, but nor did the US until very recently. Let's be clear. It was supporting every dictator in sight until a few years ago. So, and it'll do it again. Exactly. But it's also, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, they're imposing all the standard things: investment protection, trade facilitation requirements on, very debt-driven kind of local participation. And they want all the standard neoliberal things that are part of the trade agreements and investment agreements that Joe was mentioning. So in their interaction with other developing countries, they are not being any kind of alternative model. If anything, they're pushing the neoliberal model.
Wayne, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, look, I agree with that. The danger in the Asia Pacific is that this same pattern of trickle-down economics is now being repeated, not only in China, but in many other emerging countries. The tax debate, for example, if we're not careful, we'll see more regressive taxes, less progressive taxes, and the emerging middle classes will start to hollow out or not emerge if these patterns continue across developing Asia. And secondly, the second biggest security threat globally is China's expansion in the South China Sea, which is and could become existential, and which is a complete repudiation of any rules-based system that anyone's aware of.
Jose Antonio, do you want to jump in quickly?
Let me, in this case, agree with Ayate in the sense that, in two ways. The first one is, of course, that the long-term vision of the Chinese, aside from the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is, in a sense, their international project, let's say, for leadership of China, but it's also the vision of industrialization. I mean, the huge jump, or the largest jump in research and development spending in the world in the last 10 years is the Chinese one. Well, the Koreans actually also are impressive, actually. But, that's it. So they do have a clear vision of becoming a major industrialized country. Anyway, but at the same time, that generates another effect, which is very little discussed on the Chinese side for sure, which is that, as I write sometimes, for example, the pattern of trade with Latin America is 19th century. So and Africa is exactly the same, and the Middle East is exactly the same. So they are exporters of manufacturers, and we, the rest of the developing world, are supposed to provide them commodities, primary goods. And that pattern, I think, at least seen from the Latin American side, I'm sure the African side is the same, it's actually collapsing.
Yeah.
It's actually collapsing. So they don't have a more sophisticated way of interacting, trade interaction with the developing world. I think that pattern may actually enter into a crisis.
Well, there's a lot that's 19th century in regards to what we've been talking about. So maybe on that note, we'll open it up just for the last 10 or 15 minutes here. And if folks have questions, just raise your hand. And I think we've got a mic that we will bring around. Oh, are you gonna? Oh, okay. Yeah, bring. Give us. I have a little sign. Oh, you have a sign. You're official. Get up here.
Hi, I have a little sign. Hi, I'm Stephen Lerner, and I'm supposed to do a quick 5-minute response. And I'm not an economist. I'm not an official. I'm your friendly neighborhood union organizer. So that's from the perspective that I take this. And as I listen to all this, the thing that keeps coming to my mind is the organizing question, which is we can have the right policy. We can be completely right. You all can debate some of the nuances on China or not. But in the end, how do we win any of this stuff? And I go back to 2008 when we failed. We failed to build a mass movement. We failed to name who the bad guys were. We failed to translate this. And then you all have said we're paying the price of that now. So I guess I just want to throw out a couple things. The question for me is, how do we translate this so that regular folks get it and say, aha? And how do we make it? It's not a matter of simplifying it, because it's not actually that complicated. Rich people have all the money and they're doing bad things with it. That's a summary of what you all just said. But then there's a question of, therefore, what do people do about that? How do we move people into action? How do we mobilize them? What's the vehicle? And it's insufficient just to say, well, every couple of years you should vote and then get screwed in the vote, and then we tell people don't be cynical. So what I keep going is to the organizing question, and how in these discussions and all these discussions do we elevate the question of how we're building a mass movement around equality, how are we building a mass movement around democracy, and I think a key part of that is how are we building a mass movement to rebuild the labor movement, because absent that, I don't know how we do any of this. So what I thought I'd do in my very brief time, which I was reminded was very brief because people know I can talk, is just give a couple of examples of some experiments we're trying in that. And first I want to just do, as a union organizer, 2 quick stories. In 2009, I spoke at this big meeting, and I have to say I had a brilliant PowerPoint that actually tracked the trillions that had been stolen. It was all home care workers in Washington State. And at the end, after my brilliant presentation of everybody was numb, they knew it was very bad and they were screwed. And this guy raises his hand and he says, I want to talk about the $2. And he kept yelling he wants to talk about the $2. And I had no idea what he's talking about. It turned out that all their paychecks had been shifted to debit cards. And because he lived in a rural area and the bank that the card was issued on didn't exist there, of his $100 paycheck, he now lost $2 every time he used it. And to him, that was financialization. I now have to pay to get my money. And that's what was real to him versus my trillions. And he nicely said to me, those trillions are nice, but that doesn't mean, what he actually said, I want my fucking $2. He was just screaming at me because he gets
There's
paid
your
every
bumper
week,
sticker.
that's 50 times. And then the second thing is, we were involved in this long, complicated discussion about tax breaks, and somebody said, oh, I get it. They're making us broke on purpose. And it was a very simple explanation. They cut their taxes so they get richer. Then, once they cut their taxes, they say, oh, well, now the government's broke, so now we'll give you predatory loans to reclaim it. Now that my wages have dropped, I'll give you a payday loan. And then, as we now find in Puerto Rico, after they cut their taxes to enrich themselves, and then they loan us more money, now that they've cut their taxes, they now say we need to get rid of democracy and need a control board. So that this idea that they're broke on purpose may be a way to try to talk about it. And sort of 4 examples of how we're trying to experiment on the ground in this is, one, we're organizing bank workers in the United States. But in addition to saying we're treated terribly, we're saying bank workers can play a unique role in regulating from below because they know how banks cheat. And for those who don't know, Wells Fargo, the cheating scandal was exposed by Wells Fargo workers long before anybody in the banking industry or the regulators knew about it. So one part is, if we need millions of people to win what you all are talking about, then what are the vehicles for them to do that? One is, workers know how they're getting ripped off, let's empower them, is one idea. Then a second, I don't know if people have heard of this campaign we have called Hedge Clippers. There's a website, hedgeclippers.org. And not only do we expose and tell the stories, but then we move people into direct action. We actually take over finance meetings where their hedge funds are gathered. We go to their homes. We say, these are the billionaires. This is how they're living. This is the consequence of the system, to try to make it real. So we have that. And then third, as part of Hedge Clippers, we've done all this work in Puerto Rico. And we did this one expose on a capital appreciation bond they took out. They borrowed $4 billion. The payback is $37 billion on one loan, because it's all backloaded, so it could be off the books. And so we not only do the report, but then we name the name of who it is. We go to their homes. We go to their kids' schools, literally, and we make it personal. These are the people who are ruining our lives, so that people have a way to get engaged. And then finally, I'll just end with giving an example. I'm sure we all know our friends at Blackstone. Is we don't just talk about Blackstone and Steve Schwarzman being rich, but we're now looking at each aspect of the company. So we've introduced legislation in the United States to tax carried interest on a state level, to reclaim what the federal government isn't doing. That for New York is $3.7 billion alone. So instead of just saying, let's wait for the feds, nobody believes it, this is something we can do locally. We're now forming, for those who don't know, Blackstone is now the largest landlord in America. We're now forming a tenants union of Blackstone tenants and have a ballot initiative in California to allow rent control. That another thing we're doing on Blackstone is we do talk about, he's the Trump guy. All the money they've made, they avoid taxes. So I guess what I'm saying is we try to wrap up all of the parts of their company, and for each aspect of your life, if you're paid minimum wage in their hotel, if they're screwing you as their landlord, they're not paying taxes, we try to make it real. And then most importantly, these are all the things you can do to express that and start to build a movement that then will give us the power to enact some of the stuff you're doing.
Can I, before you step away,
I'm
can
on
I?
my time, right?
No, but I want you to stay longer. Because you've helped me write my next 2 columns. I'm curious, just to kind of link a couple of things that the panel was talking about. I'm curious what you would say as an organizer to the shift from tangible to intangible and the importance of data as labor, you know, the potential for people maybe being able to recapture with the right legislation some wealth as we kind of shift the economy and the rules. Do you see possibilities?
So as part of a shameless pitch, there's an article that just came out in the American Prospect by myself, Joe McCartan, and Sarita Gupta called, what is it called? It's not the future of work at stake, it's the future of workers' equality and democracy. And we sort of challenge this whole future of work myth as a distraction because we're not dealing with the real issue, which is wealth and power concentration. But in that, one of the things we talk about is it's not that technology is good or bad, it's who controls it. And so if you talk about Uber, if that was a utility and it was publicly controlled, we would feel differently about Uber. If you talked about Amazon as a public utility, so I think that this question of the merger of what, I made up the word techno-monopolies, I don't know if that exists, somebody else said it first, and Wall Street, the combination of financialization and technological monopoly is exactly what we need to tackle. So when you think about Amazon, that's everything from the conditions of Amazon workers to the fact, for those who didn't see it, that Amazon was selling Nazi material on the Amazon thing, to the tax breaks, that how do we look at each piece? And I think we need to challenge all of them at once. And that if we don't do that, it ends up being this sort of abstraction for people. So I think that that's a critical question. It's not a matter of being a Luddite. The question is technological and other change for whom and who controls it. And I guess what I'd end with is we're at this very funny moment. We have full employment. We have all of this going on. This is the moment to challenge their incredible power and to deal with what I think you all are saying, the question of redistribution of wealth and power. And absent that, I think we see more and more the rise of the right wing, because if we're not offering solutions and ideas, other people will. So I don't know if that...
Fantastic, really great. You know, I saw an interesting study that union membership actually rises in recoveries as opposed to downturns. So it's a good moment, as you say.
I guess. I'll end with, I'm optimistic, but I'm not so optimistic about union membership right now.
Okay, well, yeah. All right, so we have maybe, I don't know, 5-10 minutes for questions. If anybody wants to ask, we've got a mic around. We'll bring it to you. Just raise your hand. Don't be shy. It's a small room. And if not, I'm just, question over here.
Okay. I'm Barry Herman, and I'm at the New School and some other places. I guess I want to put some of these pieces together because I think Stephen kind of blew all this polite conversation out of the water, which he does quite well. I think Jose Antonio's analysis on multilateralism is spot on, that the system is collapsing. And I think the reason, the source, you talked about sources, the sources were mentioned by Gabriel and Wayne. I mean, there are deep changes in the societies. There's a lot of scapegoating going on in the US, racism with immigrants in Europe and so on. So the only people I see interested or perhaps reliably committed to working together across international borders are the central bankers. You know, they have their swap lines. No, I'm serious. They have their swap lines.
Yeah.
They've always been a bit divorced from the political situation, but that's not enough. In the U.S., the finance, the Treasury, the finance ministry of the U.S. has been more globalist than any other part of the U.S. government, but I don't know how reliable that is. So what is, I wouldn't say plan B, what is scenario B when the globalization doesn't get rescued and there's another financial crisis?
Okay, nice simple question. Who wants to take that one? Joe, I think you're on the hot spot.
Okay, so I think one wants to separate out the various pieces of globalization. I think the trade regime is really in trouble right now. some of you may know that the U.S. has been vetoing the reappointment of appellate judges, and they lose a quorum very soon. So they will no longer be able to act effectively. And then it will really be up to the rest of the world to decide whether they want to rescue the WTO. Some lawyers say that they don't need unanimity, but whether they do or not, they can go forward and say, okay, in the meanwhile, until the United States joins the club again, rejoins the club, we're going to have a court that applies to the rest of us. We can't have a WTO without an appellate mechanism. It was a really big, it was a core change between that and the previous GATT. Or whether they just let it fall apart in the hopes that in 2020 there'll be a more multilateral person. Now, I think, let me just back off for a second. We are so interdependent. You know, you take an iPhone and you talk about the number of places where it's made, that the real move away from multilateralism has been exaggerated, I think. And you look at Trump's renegotiation of NAFTA. You know, there's a lot of roar, and what did he came up with a pimple, you know, changing the rules of the fraction that had to be made in North America by a little bit, and changing, and a little bit more had to be produced by higher wage workers, but it was not a big deal. You look at the renegotiation of the Korean-U.S. agreement. The key provision there was that Korea agreed to allow 50,000 unsafe American cars that did not meet their safety standards into the country. But they had allowed 25,000 before, and nobody bought them. So allowing an additional 25,000 to come in when nobody wants them is not going to make a big deal. So I think you have to understand the rhetoric is very different from the reality. There are some really important issues like global warming that we cannot deal with on a unilateral, basis. And I think there's awareness that of the need for multilateralism. So I'm not as pessimistic. I think it will be reconstructed after Trump on a different basis. I mean, I think it won't be done on the belief that we are moving inevitably towards a world without borders. Trump has reminded us that borders matter. But I think it will be with a recognition that we almost had a global crisis, and that we now need to create hopefully a better multilateral system.
Okay, Jerry, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, I agree that multilateralism, yes, there is this threat, perhaps not as much, but, I think WTO is a bit like, how they say about things, it feels so good when it stops hurting. So now that it's about to die, suddenly everybody's saying, oh, it was wonderful. But it wasn't really that wonderful. I mean, I think we have to recognize that it was very unequal. And it created a global trade architecture that was very much to the detriment of working people in developing countries as well. Everybody sort of imagines that, the big gainer was China because it could control its economy and do all the regulation, etc. Most of the developing world, a lot of workers actually suffered from this multilateralism. In India, we cannot implement a food security act. We have more hungry people than all of sub-Saharan Africa together because of WTO rules. So I'm not so sure that we want to promote necessarily the same WTO.
Yeah.
So just because Trump wants to bash it doesn't mean that we have to fight for the same thing back.
Right, two things can be true. Yeah. Okay, there was a question over here.
As you have written, Joe,
Yeah,
right?
I think it will be a multilateralism that will be markedly different.
Yeah.
And that it will have to be put together again, but it won't be, we're in 2020 that we'll be talking about, and that far different from the era when the WTO was created. And we now know the problems. Just to give you one more example, Chapter 11 of NAFTA, which is the investment provision, when that was passed, there was no discussion in the White House about it. I was teasing some of the NGOs, why didn't you make a stink about it? And their response is, it was a lot of complex garbage. We didn't know what it meant. But now people do understand what it means. And so when you put it together again, I don't think you'll have the old Chapter 11.
Yeah. Okay.
So maybe the man with the orange hair is an opportunity.
Okay,
Not only a
let's stick with the positive. Let's
It's,
get in one more
well, my
question
point
here.
is exactly what Jayati just said. I see this as an opportunity. This is a window of opportunity because we are not happy with the way the WTO work. We're not happy with the way trade has delivered, and we know we need redistributive policy, but we can't wait until 2020. We need to reinvent the narrative now, and we need to decide what these rules are and what the new policies are, and bring the rest of the people with us. So we have a lot of bright people on this panel. What are the three things that what's the narrative? And what are the three things that we need to tell people that we need to have? I was flabbergasted. I work for the NAFTA. And we had NGOs coming to us and complaining about the investment state dispute resolution. Where are they now? The U.S. is actually asking to loosen that. They've been trying to do that for years, and now they're not even there to push toward that. Why? Because it's Trump. You don't want to support Trump when he's doing something that you've been trying to do for 10 years. I think we need to be pragmatic. There are things that are not working that we need to change, and there's a window of opportunity, and somehow we get stuck in this debate. It's the bad guys or the good guys instead of how do we get to the good policies?
Okay, so on that note, why don't we everybody
Yeah.
chime in with one policy,
Oh,
low-hanging
I
fruit.
I have several.
Several. Okay, well you get a minute. So for your several.
No. Actually, investment regime, for example, the taxation, which is the topic of ICRICT, some international taxation rules, intellectual property rights, rethinking intellectual property rights, and have some international agreement on migration.
Okay.
Wow.
Jayati?
Oh, fortunately, Jose Antonio's got all of Jose Antonio's, and plus something that doesn't allow multinationals to insist on labor flexibility rules
Okay.
inside. Yeah.
Joe?
Yeah, so I agree with all of them. And I guess I think that trying to do a better job, coming back to the subject of our discussion here, do a better job in multilateral regulation of the financial sector, because that is a source of both the inequality that we've been talking about, the organizing of the tax evasion and tax avoidance, a whole range of predatory activities, and the instability that we experienced in 2008 and will almost surely experience again.
Wayne?
Parties of the centre-left globally have to re-earn the trust of working people by reasserting economic justice as being their central mission.
Okay. Gabriel?
Tax justice, which means concretely, taxing pretty heavily the main winners from globalization. So concretely, a steeply progressive wealth tax with rates up to 5, 6, 7% per year for the very wealthiest people. That would lead to a more equal distribution of wealth in the long run, and so more equal distribution of power.
Okay. Well, since we've ended with solutions and a bright note, I think this is a good place to stop. In terms of the narrative, I would just say the thing that I find resonates with readers is, in a 70% consumer economy, there's only so many pairs of jeans and houses and cars that rich people can buy, and so you have to put money in a few more people's pockets. That seems to resonate pretty well with our readers. So anyway, I want to thank the panel for all your great ideas and commentary. Thanks for the good questions, and thanks everybody for coming.
Okay.